Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to number 99 of our Let's Talk About session. So we found hit quite a spot number at this stage. The series was found during COVID, and we'd now like to extend a welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and also our non-members. Just to give you a background, the Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK, and today we have around 260 plus members, wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional communicators based around the world. And we have a 50-50 split between the UK and the rest of the world. There's more information about the Circle on our website. And also, if you're interested in joining, then please do look at the application form there. And if you are not a member, you can also join our mailing list where we invite you to attend such events if you're not a member. I'd now like to hand over to Michelle Shah, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Andrea, and I'm delighted to welcome Adrian Bridge, the CEO of Fladgate Partnership. Adrian has pioneered new styles of port, as well as encouraging the production and promotion of Portuguese table wines across the world. And over the years, Adrian has also greatly contributed to the success of Porto's tourism, initially opening one of the first boutique wine hotels, the Yeatman, and more recently by investing in the launching of the World of Wine, a cultural district aimed at taking Porto's tourism destination to yet another level. A very warm welcome to Adrian, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. So over to you, Adrian.
Michelle, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody in Portuguese time zone. Good morning or good evening, or if you are elsewhere in the world. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll talk on the subjects of sort of port wine tourism, a little bit about Portuguese table wine, and really try to give you a flavor of what it is that it's happening here in Portugal, but I think also try to draw out, if we can, some of the lessons that we've learned here in Portugal in the hope that they may well be applicable elsewhere in the world. So I'm very happy to really focus on my comments around Portugal, but certainly when it gets to questions, if I can discuss anywhere else in the world, I'll be happy to do so. So revolution in wine tourism. I thought the best place for us to really start this talk was for me to sort of go through what is wine tourism. So, what do we mean by it? And I've got a couple of different quotes here. A tour visit to wineries, wine festivals or events, important motivation for the tourist to understand essentially wine. And then for Wikipedia, it again refers to a lot of broad sense of tasting, consumption, purchase of wine, walks and vineyards, and visits to wineries. And in a sense that we would agree with those things, but I think what we need to probably remember is a little bit about the wine industry. So my first sort of point I want to really make here is to remind ourselves about what the wine industry is and where it sits, and what are the economic levers that are involved in the wine industry. And there's a reason for this, because it's very different to what we find in tourism. So, wine is a primary economic activity. That is to say, like mining, any agricultural business, oil extraction, forestry. It is essentially extracting produce from the land, and therefore the factors that tend to drive the industry would be that it's supply-led, that we take the price we're given, that is that the market dictates essentially what they will pay for the product and find somebody who will fulfill at that price. There is, and this is certainly true with wine, although a lot of us work very hard, and certainly the Circle of Wine Writers makes a huge effort to educate consumers about wine and styles of wine. It's nonetheless true that in many people's minds, all wine is the same, and with most primary economic activity, that is the same. Your oil delivery from Saudi Arabia is probably not that much different from the one that's coming from Venezuela or United States or elsewhere in the world. So that is the reality of primary economic activity. And of course, the way you tend to try to make money out of this is that by controlling your costs, and you look to gain wealth through long-term capital growth. And many people in the wine industry probably wouldn't recognize those points as being relevant. And most of them would probably push back at me and say, but we've got a brand, we do things differently, we tell our story and so on. All of which is probably true. But if we don't accept that that is at its core what the wine industry is about, then I think we sometimes might miss some of the levers that we need to pull in running our business or thinking about our business. And I mention this because it's in very direct contrast to a tertiary economic activity, and that is a service-based industry, of which examples of this would be banking, administration, writing, hotels, restaurants, bars, administration. This is all the service industry, and increasingly, obviously, in many parts of the world, the service industry is a more dominant part of the industry. The secondary, by the way, the secondary economic activity in between is pure industry. It's turning raw materials into things and selling them. That's what the secondary economic activity is. But here we're on the tertiary. And of course, the tertiary tends to be demand driven. We tend to make our prices, and I'll come back to that. And it is a product that is diverse in character. So it's a heterogeneous product. Again, if I'm putting that into your business of writing about wines, we've all got a dictionary and a thesaurus, but the way that each of you line those words up differently is what makes your product completely different to anyone else. And indeed, what we are in a tourism business, you tend to be profit maximizers rather than cost minimizers, and we tend to measure success by the profit and the return on investment. And I mention this, and I mention this specifically because it's very, very different from wine. So as we've seen a trend around the world of people moving into wine tourism, they've often sort of got into it without necessarily understanding the business that they're getting into. And it's important to understand the differences between these two, because in a typical wine structure that's set up for a primary economic activity, you may not have the skills or the business methodologies that are ideal for tertiary. And likewise, if you're in the tertiary economic activity, it may not work for the extractive industry. And so if I sort of try to encapsulate where I think sort of wine tourism essentially is and the wine industry is, I mean, at the core of what we do in the wine tourism, the core of it is a wine business. And a wine business, obviously, it's perfectly able to survive simply on making its wine, selling its wine, and going about doing its normal business. But increasingly, the pressure within wine business, and indeed with in this sense of enotourism, wine tourism, is to move into what we would call ancillary activities or services. And that's fairly straightforward. And that's the tasting room, the winery tours, the winery shop. And that's a step most people have in fact made. And it seems a fairly gentle way to move out of the core wine business, and has all the collateral benefits of being able to showcase your wines, give people a sense of place, tell your story in a more authentic fashion. It's certainly more easy to do that at the winery than it is to do it via a PowerPoint or a presentation somewhere else in the world. And of course, nowadays, most of us have realized that if we do that properly, then we can also make money out of those ancillary activities or ancillary services. People will actually pay to come and visit, pay to do the tastings, and we don't have to give away as many samples. And so, it's an important additional part. But of course, what we find and what we've seen here in Portugal is that everybody tends to do the same thing. So in the town of Porto at the moment, there are 17 different port wine cellar visits, more or less telling the same story, all providing a tasting and all providing consumers to interact with port. But of course, the typical consumer is not going to visit 17 different wineries doing the same thing. I think there was a study done in New South Wales that on average consumers tend to visit about 2 3/4 wineries as the maximum amount that they will do, for the reasons perhaps that are obvious. And the next outer layer of this that we look at is the auxiliary activities, and this is not naturally where a wine company would fit, and this falls squarely in that tertiary economic activity, which is the restaurants, the hotels, the transport services, and so on and so forth. Transport, I mean by that taxis and so on and so forth. This is important, and an important potential source of revenue, but is often best filled by people who are experts in that area. And on the final ring I've got on my sort of circle of influences, circle of issues, is obviously government, whose job is really to provide infrastructure, transport, utilities, all the things that allow businesses to function. Now, the interesting thing is that many governments want to sort of jump straight into the middle orange part of this and set up tasting rooms and wineries and tasting rooms and tours and museums in wine locations, because they feel that because they happen to be in local government in a particular area, they can take the lead on that. And I think it's a major challenge for the wine industry, in so much as those politicians often don't tend to be able to tell the authentic story of what it is that one is doing or why one is doing it. And indeed, that can sometimes lead to consumer confusion. Now, I mention all these because, in a sense, our business of being 330 years old, making port, we've jumped into that green area of the auxiliary activities and did so, less than 20 years ago. And primarily that was with the building of something called the Yeatman, which I'm going to put up a slide here. There's a picture on the upper left-hand side of the site with the trees and a few of the brand names sort of which are normally illuminated by night and visible and a key part of what the historic area of Porto is like. And now you see implanted into that hill the Yeatman. In that iteration that you've got there, it's an 82-bedroom hotel. It's now been expanded to 109 through construction on one side of it. But broadly speaking, that property was an attempt to make a very direct movement into the wine tourism business. And the logic behind it was that if people were kind of interested in port, they were interested in wine. If they're interested in port and wine, they were interested in good and food. So hence, I was able to rally most of the top wine producers in Portugal to sponsor bedrooms, was able to hire a chef who had had a Michelin star, and that allowed us to create our food proposition. It has the best Portuguese wine list in the world, logic being that most people coming to Portugal would want to taste Portuguese wines, and that still is the case. But it was a very deliberate attempt to try to capture people who were going to come to learn about port, have the opportunity to experience port and Porto, and perhaps go up to the Douro, and indeed through that, create some sort of emotional connection to the products and to the place, which would help stimulate sales. And that's in a sense been the logic from the outset of our journey, is to create for the customer a very clear way that they can discover and learn about our product. Of course, what's very, very important as soon as you go into wine tourism is that whatever you produce is consistent with the positioning of your brand. And as I travel around the world and see some examples of wine tourism and wine brands, you sometimes find there is a mismatch between how they present themselves and how in their marketing brief and their presentation around the world, and what you actually discover when you open the door during a visit. So that is also a key point and a key learning for us, that we've had to be absolutely consistent in the way that we present our products, aligned with what people would perceive us to have as brands. I just throw in a nice picture here of the valley, but you can see then where there were hotels sit sort of in the space of the city. Now, the key point about this, and I'm overlaying two different charts here, and there's a couple of different things to say in this. The first is that Porto as a destination, as shown here by the orange bars, and the Sheraton, and this is Sheraton 2005, when the average hotel, five-star hotel in the city had annual occupancies of 42%, which is below what you need for a five-star hotel. Typically, you would need to look at average annual occupancies around 60 to 63% in order to start making money at a five-star level. So most of them were operating below that level. And as you can see from this chart, that most of them, most of the hotels that existed, I picked on the Sheraton, I've got the data, but it's consistent with others in the city. You know, the lowest point of occupancy is July and August. And that is because that's when people are on holiday, and therefore they're not coming to the destination, weren't coming to Porto because Porto is a business destination. And what I've overlaid on that is essentially what the Yeatman did last year, and you can see the degree of seasonality. You know, in most of those columns, with the exception of November, we're above the seasonal occupancies you would have seen sort of 20 years ago, and particularly so in that May to October period, which is when most people are taking their holidays. And so this is the difference essentially between a leisure destination versus a business destination. And you perhaps see it most profoundly in this chart, where I'm showing you what people used to pay to come here. So you've got, again, August, you can see there, the figure gets down to 85 euros for a five-star hotel bedroom. Okay, this is back in 2005, but I think even most of us would agree that that is probably a more a fairly low price. And then you've got the Yeatman last year, where your peak is in September. The reason for September is the number of people who are stimulated to come out to visit harvest. You can see also August is a little bit softer than the other months. Partly that's to do with, in August, you tend to get people staying for longer periods. Instead of staying for 2 days, they stay for a week. And that tends to mean that they're able to get better packages. But the broad point about this is that there is a huge difference that has taken place in the destination. And really, the Yeatman was the first one to do that. Of course, tourists coming to Portugal have been in growth for a number of years. And if we look to last year, and this is the total country rather than any one region. I'll come on to the northern Portugal in a moment. But you can see that in the last decade, obviously excluding the COVID periods here, but you've seen a steady build from around about 16.5 million visitors a year to just over 13 million. So Portugal is attracting tourists from around the world, and that is having a profound effect. And I think that is making, it's certainly influencing a number of our businesses, particularly influencing what we're doing in our port business, and indeed now with our move into table wine. If I narrow that down really to here in the north, and I look at what we've got with Douro and Porto. Note here, please, that on the left-hand scale, you've got Douro, which is in the blue. On the right hand, you've got Porto. And so the Douro is about 1/10 of the size. But in order to get something that we could look at that wasn't going to compress the Douro too much, I put a left and a right-handed scales here. But you can see that essentially there's been fairly consistent growth. But a point of note would be, you can see there in 2021 and to a certain extent into 2022, more movement to the Douro. I think this would probably be true if we looked at many regions around the world, and that's really being driven by domestic tourism rather than international tourism, where local market was forced to or decided to go and discover more remote parts of the country that they hadn't previously visited. So there's been this drive by people coming to visit. It's happening across the country. It isn't all about beach holidays in the Algarve, and indeed much of this growth is really coming to sort of Lisbon, Porto, the urban centres of Portugal, and a very different tourism offer to what people historically thought of is as when you considered Portugal really was golf and sand in the Algarve. It's a very different destination now. And, I'm also, 6 years ago, I helped found a company called Unlock Boutique Hotels. We run 21 hotels across the whole country. They're typical sort of 30 to 40 room-sized hotels. And so, I've obviously got very direct experience of what's happening right across the country, including three hotels in the Algarve. So this is an interesting challenge. And of course, when people are coming, when they're coming to the cities, the question is, what are they going to do? And I think that becomes a key question, because to my way of thinking, the future of tourism is really more about experiences. I'm sure you've heard that from other people before, but there's certainly evidence that there's lots of people who are motivated by experiences and wanting to learn and discover. And what that means is essentially content is key. And what we found was in the city of Porto, there really weren't any museums. Historically, our city was dominated by the church, and in the foreground of here, you've got the cathedral, and behind it, the bishop's palace. Most of the big buildings in our city are church buildings. Nobles weren't allowed to live in Porto in the city walls or stay for more than 3 nights without receiving a fine. So we don't have lots of big noble houses that have been converted into museums or galleries. We don't have Burlington House with the Royal Academy, or elsewhere in the world you find those big houses are converted to museums. And as a result, the key point was that in Porto, there really wasn't any museums or any content. And so we set out to build, the World of Wine. This was converting old port lodges, which for historic reasons were in the city centre, not a very sensible place from the point of view of trucks and wine movements. And those, over the course of the decade from about 2010 through till just under 2019, we basically built a lot of capacity for storing our ports up in the Douro, next to the wineries where they're made, in modern facilities which are better for our workers, but we're able to humidity control, temperature control. They're high on the hills, and very much where we can replicate the climatic conditions which have influenced the long-term aging of our ports, and then convert that space to the World of Wine. And what the World of Wine is all about is about creating content. So we've got 7 museums, the flagship of which is something called the Wine Experience. The Wine Experience is probably, at the moment, considered the best wine museum in the world. It's about a 2-hour visit for most people, and whether you are new to wine or even an MW with an awful lot of experience, I think you'll find something or to learn and appreciate in that museum. And effectively, what it does, it takes the story of where wine comes from. It looks at all the climatic conditions, the soil, the growing seasons, and so on, and it works right the way through that. And it then uses Portugal as examples, but it shows people, how to taste, how to explore, and it ultimately ends up with a wine tasting. And we get about 1,000 people a day who are visiting just that one experience. Across the rest, we've got one on the history of the city. We've got something on chocolate. We've got a quite fun one on rosé wine called the Pink Palace. We've got quite a serious museum on drinking vessels, which is a private collection, etc., etc. But you can get the sort of sense of it. And what the World of Wine has done has essentially, and what I was trying to do with the World of Wine, which sits below the Yateman next to Taylor's and right in the heart of the historic area, is really to create a cultural district. And that is to say that we wanted to make something that was big enough that it would create a sea change in our area. And as this slide shows, there are a huge number of new hotels. The ones that have got names, by and large, are open. The Beersley isn't open yet, but you can see here 15 new hotels that have either been built or being built around the World of Wine, which is really transforming the center of the city. This is purely hotels. If I actually were to overlay this with alojamento local, which is in most parts of the world, Airbnb would be the biggest brand that does local accommodation. You would see somewhere a region of 4,500 Airbnb beds in this area as well. So there's been a dramatic transformation of the city. And in a sense, what I'm hoping, and we're already beginning to see, is that other port lodges will also be converted into other cultural assets, possibly not things that replicate what we've done, but things that are in addition. And in that way, we can create an even bigger destination. Because when I did the Yeatman, my objective on the Yeatman, and I said that I would measure success by the number of private aircraft that were at the San Carnero airport, and we ended up with somewhere in the region of a couple of thousand a year coming through there now. With the World of Wine, I'm looking really to put it on the bucket list of people from Asia and elsewhere in the world. Now, moving swiftly on here, I just want to go to shift gears to sort of talk about tourism in the sense of who's got the money these days. So, most of us who are exposed to wine, everybody wants to know what you're doing for the Gen Z and the millennials, the new people are coming along. This is a McKinsey study. This is actually one that was published about a week ago. But it's very interesting that you see the boomers and what they call the silent generation. But these are the people over the age of 50, 55, where if you look at the United States, where somewhere in the region of 70% of the wealth actually sits at this level, the two most important activities that they're looking to treat themselves with are travel, restaurants, dining out, and bars. And that's pretty much true for all the other age categories. The exception on Gen Z is that you can see they're more interested in apparel, or apparel sits just ahead of apparel and footwear just ahead of where they are in travel and dining and restaurants. But you get the sense here that people want to go, they want to experience. And we've seen that here. I mean, these are our numbers. These are numbers both in Porto and Douro of people coming to visit our facilities. And if you add the two of them up, so last year we would have had somewhere in the region of 250,000 consumers who would have come through and had an experience in one of our visitor centres. This is not the World of Wine. This is just purely the visitor centres of Taylor, Fonseca, and Croft, both in the city and up in the Douro. And I want to just dive quickly into two markets, if I may, to really sort of draw out what perhaps is happening here. So in this particular chart, I'm actually looking at visitors to Taylor's specifically, and I'm looking at ones from the United States and ones from Korea. And you can see that that America's had a fairly steady growth. Again, we'll ignore the COVID period, but a fairly steady growth there. Korea has also had a very strong growth. Now, what kickstarted Korea on the destination was that in 2018, we rented the Yeatman to Samsung for a month when they ran a conference for an entire month, rotating through Samsung employees from around Europe. Knowing that was happening, we put on in the Taylor Visitor Center a Korean-based audio guided tour, which obviously has helped stimulate that interest. And you see that Korea sits for Taylor's in its top 10 number of source of visitors. I'm going to I just thought I'd put in here a quite, that was just to remind me to have a drink. Here I'm going to just take those two markets of the States and Korea, and here I'm looking at shipments from the entire port industry, which fluctuate depending on stock. And you saw a downturn last year because of the rise of the cost of money and distributors reducing their stock holdings from 10-month sales down to about 8-month sales. So I'm going to jump from that just really to case depletions. And this is in fact our case depletions as a business. And what you're seeing here is there's strong growth in the market, and I would contend that a lot of that continues to be driven by people who are coming here, having their experience, and then going home and sharing that experience with friends and family and consuming more port as a result of having come here and visited. And this, as I say, this is our port business. It doesn't touch our table wine yet. But if I look at, again, Korea, this is Korea, and I've got a decade of data here for Korea, slightly longer than I've got for than was on the tourist numbers, but you can see here steady growth in that, and that's 9 liter cases, and this is actually in in turnover. Again, a little bit soft last year, but again, that's people reacting to stock in the market and the cost of money. But what we're seeing here is this direct correlation between our ability to sell more product in the market as a result of having more visitors coming to visit us. But of course, people aren't just coming to visit Portugal. What we're seeing is lots of people are actually coming to live in Portugal. And this piece of data here is off the website from the Frontier Force that looks after the borders of Portugal. And you've seen an increase from 421,000 people, foreigners living in the country, up last year to 781 at the end of 22. Last year, we got close to 850,000 people who have decided to come and live in Portugal. And so that's beginning to be quite a significant proportion of our population, given that we're only a 10.5 million people nation. Interestingly, if you look within that, the places, the United States, for example, in the last, or since 2018, so in the last 5 years, the number of Americans living in Portugal has actually tripled. So not only are we seeing an awful lot of American visitors. 10 years ago, there were 30,000 American visitors a year coming to Portugal. Last year, there were over 2 million. So there's been an absolute jump in the number of people that are coming in. Obviously, there's reasons for that. Portugal is safe. Most people speak English. It's good value. There's good food. There's good wine. There's lots of reasons to recommend it. And it's about as far to the right of New York as Los Angeles is to the left. So it's a question really of which way do you turn as you go out of the JFK. But lots of them are coming, and it's interesting when I extract. Again, this is from the Frontier Force. You can see, and this is just taking 21 and 22 data. So this is really an explosion that's been taking place post-COVID of people coming to Portugal. You can see there in North America, they've got data there because they're including Canada, up 34% in a year. South America, that's mostly Brazilians, 17%. A lot of the Brazilians would be motivated to come here for work. A lot of the Africans are South Africans who've come here under Golden Visa Scheme to retire or to invest money. Asia, you can see they're up 16%. And so we've got this strong growth, Asia, Latin America, North America, that is coming to visit Portugal. And of course, that's driving the demand we're seeing for our products elsewhere in the world. And one final thing is just to say, because just to give you information, these people are settling across the country. What's interesting is the number. There's a certain quantity in the Algarve, and obviously the Algarve is where particularly the British would go. British now are about 45,000 Brits living in Portugal. Again, that's about a 300% increase from a decade ago. But you can see that the people are spread right across the country, but there is a domination there of Lisbon. But it's making a big impact in our country. And one of the impacts we're seeing is not just new hotels, but also new restaurants. And if I just put up a chart here, you can see that a decade ago, there were 12 restaurants that had either 1 or 2 stars from Michelin. This year, Michelin has decided to launch its guide simply for Portugal. So previously it was Spain and Portugal, so it was just covering the Iberian Peninsula, but now Portugal has its own guide, and there are 38 restaurants that have got stars. The pictures at the top are from the 2-star at the Yeatman. But my point about this is that the number of people who are visiting, but also the number of people who are coming to live here, is absolutely driving a revolution in the wine, in the restaurant trade, with lots of new restaurants opening, high quality restaurants. And although there's 38 there with stars, there's probably at least another 40 behind that sooner or later could get a star. So there's a real revolution happening. And to give you a sense of that, that is driving with our distribution business here in Portugal. It's driven a 300% increase in the business that we have selling fine wine into restaurants in Portugal. And it's in contrast to, we have two businesses in distribution, one that does fine wine and one that does, is more a cash and carry and does the more basic end of the market. And that over the same period has grown only 22%. The other has grown over 300%. So you can see this is because of the shift of fine dining, number of restaurants, and a revolution that's taking place. And the interesting thing about this is it's not just driving a revolution in Portugal. I pull up this quote from Wine and Spirit magazine, Josh Green, his restaurant poll published a month or so ago. And he draws out the point here that, sommeliers being asked, what is the regions that they are looking at? And Portugal is up there at the top, just in front of France and Spain. And this is where sommeliers in America are looking to add Portuguese wine. So again, I would contend that this is people coming, having that positive experience, going home and looking for the product, and that's driving. So this is a demand-driven adjustment that's going to take place in wine lists around the United States. And indeed, our reaction to that as a company was to get into the table wine business. So last August, we bought a company called Ideal Drinks, which gave us a number of vineyards in the Minho, in the Down, and in the Bairrada region. And then about 6 weeks ago, we bought a company called Quinta de Portal, which is table wine from the Douro. So we've now firmly moved ourselves into the fine wine Portuguese market. And it's interesting, the business we bought with from the Minho, Down, and the Bairrada, 97% of their business up until we purchased it was in the domestic market. But we as a company, 93% of our business is export. So clearly what we purchased this for, to meet that demand that we're receiving from customers around the world who are looking for, who are looking to list Portuguese wines, and particularly high-end Portuguese wines. So in a sense, the point about this that I'm trying to make is that obviously as a business we have moved into this area. We've done so with very open eyes and understanding that there are very different necessities in actually running a business, which is very different. Hotels, restaurants are very, very different. I was giving an example on Unlock. I mentioned, that was a boutique hotel company. I mentioned we have 21 boutique hotels across the country. We only have 6 restaurants in those 21 hotels, because restaurants in a hotel is a whole lot of a different business to just the accommodation part of a hotel. So it just shows some of the complexities of tourism, but obviously when it's done well and it gives people an amazing experience, then we can influence their consumption. And we've seen that and benefited from that here in Portugal. I've demonstrated to you a couple of examples in the States and Korea where we've been able to benefit in increased interest in Portuguese wines, particularly port, but now we'll be able to serve that into table wine as well because the demand is there. So this is an example, I think, of a virtuous circle of port, wine, tourism working together to create a very interesting, sustainable business, which I believe is fundamental to being able to position our company certainly for the future. We may have been around for 332 years, but that is nothing if we don't have a future. And so that's why we've moved into this area and are seeing the benefits of it. And I think that I would suggest that it's a revolution that we're beginning to see elsewhere in the world. Clearly, those of you in the United States would point to Napa, which started well before us, and the positive effects that has had on Californian wine. But we're also, those of you who perhaps have seen recent revolutions in Champagne with a number of new hotels that are opening there, will perhaps agree that wine tourism, the opportunity for consumers to have an experience, taste wines in situ, become passionately involved in those, is creating a business model that is very sustainable into the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Goodness me, it's quite staggering what you've actually achieved in recent years. And I'm sure there'll be a number of questions from people here today. My first question was, Porto isn't enormous, and with the growth that you have explained today, is the infrastructure, is it sort of wobbling, or is it quite firm to sort of deal with the huge growth in hotels and accommodation and visitors, etc., etc.?
Yeah, we had 15 million people through the airport last year. There's still capacity in that airport. It's interesting that Lisbon at the moment is at its limit. They've been talking about redoing the Lisbon airport for probably 20 years, and they keep seeing a debate as to where they're going to do it. The new government that started in Portugal following the elections in mid-March have said that they will give a decision this year on where that Lisbon airport is going to be built, and that'll take probably at least a decade to do. So at this moment, the spare capacity that exists at the airport is actually up here in Porto. And Porto serves about 110 destinations directly. It's a hub for Ryanair, so a lot of air movement. In terms of the city, I mean, anyone visiting today will find it a little bit disrupted because there is an extension of the underground metro going in, which is causing parts of the city centre to be closed. But that should be completed by the end of 2024. And then that additional infrastructure will facilitate much better movement around. I think what we're seeing with the new hotels on that slide I showed, that's all on the south side of the river, where historically there hasn't been a lot, and it's still only 20 minutes from there to the airport. What I think personally is there's probably not enough bridges, and I don't mean obviously enough of Adrian and his children. There's not enough bridges in the city because one of the restrictions in any town that is built on two sides of the river is the ability to connect the two sides together. And I think that there is going to be a need for additional infrastructure there. We saw that issue happening, and back in 2017, in preparation for the World of Wine, we actually launched a ferry service to shuttle people to and fro across the river, which again is a kind of logical response that one day I hope will be superseded by having better bridge connections from one side to the other. So yeah, the infrastructure is okay. Clearly there's a bit more of a strain on it. And I think where the bigger pressure probably comes is in relation to staff. Because as hotels are built and people are pushed out of the city centre, then the staff themselves have to travel in. Again, the metro is going to facilitate that. Again, I kind of felt that was likely to be an issue. And so in 2018, we bought a number of houses that are all within 500 meters, 600 meters of the Yateman or the World of Wine. And so we have accommodation of about 150, just over 150 staff members, so they can walk to work. And it's really for those people who are just starting in their jobs, who tend to be on lower salaries and therefore can't afford a lot of rent and certainly don't want to spend money on transport. But yeah, the infrastructure is there. There is always a time lag. We're not at the level that Venice is with the need to charge people to come into the city yet. But there are no doubt that that planners need to continue to consider that we will remain in growth.
I think Michelle's got a bit of a follow-on question from that. Michelle?
Yes, it's sort of similar, and I think it's absolutely commendable, the development that's being made. And I don't want to be polemic, but living near to Florence, I can see how things really get kind of out of hand, and so many cities around the world maybe haven't taken into consideration the negative aspects of tourism. I'm sure that now, with all these examples that you have of other cities such as Florence and Amsterdam, Venice, you probably must have taken Portuguese have taken into consideration how to curtail and how to manage this?
Yeah, this is where wine tourism, I think, has a major role to play. And of course, this is one of the challenges within governments, because they have the health lobby who are arguing about anti-alcohol. I would contend that wine is a very different alcohol to spirits and beers and so on, simply because it has a very distinct place of origin, and it's not coming from a commodity grain, but actually coming from a specific zone where very often not many other crops grow. If you take the Douro has essentially been a monoculture destination for, from a socioeconomic perspective, it is all about port and now wines. It's all about the grape. What tourism is doing, of course, is diversifying the economy, broadening the a number of full-time jobs, particularly for younger people who can then stay in the valley, but also boosting the service industry demands. And Portugal's looking at wine tourism as a way to develop tourism into the interior and therefore relieve some of the pressure on the cities. Inevitably, the town of Porto is a gateway to the Douro Valley, but it's also a gateway to elsewhere here in northern Portugal, and indeed to Aveiro, which is about an hour or so south of us. So it is a gateway that allows people to experience lots of it. But there's definitely a strategic initiative and sense to try to get more happening in the interior to help those economies to develop and to take the pressure off the cities. But again, there's always going to be a time lag on that. And if I look at the Douro, which arguably is still underserved by hotels, they've got the infrastructure, you can get there easily on the roads, but that means people go there and come back in a day. And the reason they don't tend to stay is the current offer, the current content. So go back to my point about the world of wine, about offering content. The current content in the Douro is limited. It broadly is tasting rooms and meals in restaurants. Nobody's really doing anything that's more diverse. Very different experience to what you have, for example, in sort of Stellenbosch, where you've got people who are doing chocolate experience, or llama, or Babylon Store, who are doing flowers and produce, and you can learn how to bake bread, and you can do all these sorts of things. That hasn't yet developed in the Douro. I think when that comes, it'll actually increase the number of hotels and reduce the pressure on the city further.
Thank you.
I'm just curious. Very interesting talk, Adrian. I'm going to be up in the Douro next week and have noticed over the past few visits a growing number of very nice little hotels. But what's been very curious, only one of them, and I can't remember the name of which one it was by the railway line, was actually offering wine tastings and tours around the vineyards. Is that something? The hotels are there, but are people not understanding how to get them from the hotel into the vineyard?
Yeah, I think you raise a very interesting point. And, I sit on a committee on the board committee at Relais Chateau, because we have a Relais Chateau property. And this is a subject that I've been discussing for a while with them, because, many Relais Chateau properties around the world, which are very beautiful boutique properties, don't necessarily engage wholly with their local wine region. So they'll have wine brands that might come from further afield, and they overlook the opportunity to have a higher indexation of local partners, which can help create content. So I think you're right, but that's because they're coming to it as hoteliers, and they're not necessarily thinking about what it means to create content. So they're looking at it and saying, we have a wine service, we need a 25% cost of wine, beverage cost in our P&L, and that requires us to put an X multiple on the wine, rather than thinking we can use this as a way to add value, encourage people to trade up, not necessarily look at percentage margins, but look at cash margins. and create a greater sense of presence and connectivity to what's around them. That's about training. That's about training and people seeing the opportunity. And that's about the hotel industry and hotel managers moving away from the traditional hotel school approach to running a hotel, to thinking about how you could be more connected. And that typically will be led by boutiques rather than by big chains. So, I think it is a matter of time, but it's the other side of the coin. It needs people who are hoteliers to be talking about the wine rather than wine people talking about hotels.
Excuse me, may I just ask a quick question? And thank you very much, Adrian, for doing this talk. It was wonderful. And to join the previous question, I mean, whenever you're in the Douro, you tend to realize that instead of hotels opening up and leading people to the vineyard, it's more often that vineyards with big enough sites start to offer hotel rooms on site. So basically doing the reverse of what you just mentioned. So, or maybe exactly what you just mentioned. So particularly winemakers expanding their portfolio and turning into hoteliers as well. And it's often led by boutiques. I don't know if the Fladgate Partnership plans to or already operates at least in some of the quintas, any hotels or accommodation, not just for trade, but for tourism purposes, or do you plan to?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Adam. It's we have a riverside property in Pinhao called the Vintage House, which was an old Taylor property. It's not in a vineyard, but it's next to vineyards, and we've developed obviously a connection between that and Quinta de Rueda, which is next door and which is ours, but Quinta de Bonfim, which is next door, which isn't ours. So we have that connection. We also have a small boutique in Quinta do Portal, which is in the heart of the vineyard, and that is a small property, and really where we see the business opportunity for that is with small groups and for weddings and situations where someone will take over the entire hotel for a party, a wedding, a meeting, or whatever. I think that I think there will be growth in that area. One of the reasons I started this company called Unlock Boutique Hotel, which is a separate, it's a sort of weekend job rather than my day job, was because of the number of people who were opening hotels who happened to have a big property, or they were property people who, in the crisis of 11 to 13 here in Portugal, decided to build a hotel on the basis that, they looked at the numbers and said, well, we have a 30-bedroom hotel, a 40-bedroom hotel, we open the door and it'll be full because the average occupancy in the region is, whatever it is, 50%, 60%, whatever the number was. And that we'll open the doors and we'll automatically be full. And they don't realize that that's not how hotels work. You've actually got to do quite a lot of effort to fill hotels, a lot of marketing, a lot of public relations, a lot of advertising, a lot of working with OTAs, DMCs, and various other people in the travel industry. And that's why we end up operating a boutique hotel management company, taking over properties from people who had given it a go and then found after 2 or 3 years they were losing lots of money, and they didn't realize why, because they didn't fundamentally realize that owning a hotel is slightly different to having guests every weekend, where you might have 3 or 4 spare rooms. You're running a house party, to actually running 30 rooms with people who are hotel guests and have different expectations of what they receive. So the answer is yes, we're in it. Yes, it will grow. It may well, I think, grow better in partnership between people who understand how to run hotels with winery owners who want to monetize the ambiance that they've got inside a spectacular vineyard, who happen to have lots of outbuildings or capacity to build something, and they can go in partnership where both will be able to sort of stick to their knitting and actually make a good success of it. Of course, one of the challenges in the Douro as a UNESCO World Heritage Site is that it's incredibly difficult now to build anything of any size that is a totally new build. And that's likely to be a dominating factor for the future in the region, and will probably lead to more product that is small village product. So you find this in northern Italy, you find it in France, where a small hamlet becomes an entire hotel. I can see that model working in the Douro. It's a more expensive operation to run as a hotel. You don't get quite the same scale economies on running lots of little houses all collective together, but you can present something very authentic and premiumized, and would overcome the construction capacity constraints that are going to dominate the Douro Valley.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, Adam. I'm not sure there's any other questions that have come up at the moment. I mean, obviously.
Can I just ask, sorry, Andrea, can I just ask one very quick question? On your photo of all your wines, on the principal label,
Yeah.
you didn't include your lovely rosé.
Well, it was a question of space.
Oh,
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, so the business we bought last August had 26 wines, and I managed to put, what have I put, 10 of them there. That range of 26 will be cut down to about 18. I think, there's no, I don't think more is necessarily better. But yeah, the rosé isn't there. Sorry, we do make some good rosé. You're right. Thank you for pointing that out.
sorry.
Yes, thank you very much, Adrian. Other people have just mentioned, thank you for mentioning South African wine tourism. Linda Simpson said, and yes, Australia is very advanced. Did you look to any of these countries for advice or guidance, or use them as a model to replicate?
Yeah, look, I think when you're doing any project, my view on it, it's a bit like a chef. I think great chefs, good chef, any chef, takes ingredients and puts them together their own particular way. Obviously, if you want to make a great meal, you probably need to start with great ingredients. So, our approach has been very much to see what people are doing all over the world, are the best of what they're doing, and sort of interpret that, not try to reinvent the wheel, but sort of bring all those ingredients together to make our unique sort of recipe of our offer. And I don't want to overextend that analogy, but it is true that sometimes one sits there looking at a blank bit of paper saying, right, I want to do a hotel, I want to make it hugely different, and you want to try and reinvent the wheel, and really there isn't much point. As you mentioned, South Africa does a fantastic job, Australia, but all over the world. I mean, I went to see things in Italy, in Spain. I travel around the world for the business of promoting port, and I spend a lot of time in hotels. You can get a very good sense of what does and doesn't work. You can talk to a lot of experienced people, and hopefully then bring that together into something that is unique. And the Yeatman works probably because it wasn't a hotel that a hotelier would have built, from a reason of the size of it, the width of the corridors, all these sorts of elements, which I had thought were important for the customer journey, but a typical hotelier wouldn't spend the money on, including things like beds. I mean, I'm actually shocked by the approach in the hotel industry from people I've spoken to in the past, who look at a bed in a very commoditized way in terms of the price of how to buy a good bed at a cheap price. The story for us was about trying to get the best quality bed to give the people the best night's sleep. And I recall that, for building the Yeatman, I got the 6 leading hotel bed suppliers in Europe to each send a sample bed, and I had them delivered to my house, and I slept on each bed. Well, supposedly slept on each bed for a month. There was one bed that after a week, my wife said, if you want to keep this test going, I'm moving to another room. As I hadn't slept well for that week either, it was definitely that one wasn't going to make it to the final cut anyway. So we moved on. But the point about it is, and I think, we benefited a lot in the brand of the Yeatman from the fact that people wake up saying, had an amazing night's sleep and I feel very refreshed, even though I had some wine and some port last night. And you go, yes, because if you get a good bed and you're comfortable and you've got good linen, and you're relaxed, you can have a good night's sleep, and it's amazing. They think the hotel is a marvelous hotel simply because they slept well. Actually, it's because they slept on a very good bed. But that's what it's all about. That's about human experience and consumer behavior, and there's a lot in that we can learn from.
Well, thank you very much. I think Michelle's got a few words to say.
Yes, well, I couldn't agree with you more there, Adrian. And anyway, thank you for a very interesting and in-depth presentation, looking at various angles and facets of wine tourism and how successful and effective it can be in encouraging new wine destinations to develop and to be embraced by a wider public. So really, it was really great presentation. Thank you very much.